Okay, so what we're going to be looking at in this session is quality management. So these are the key questions you need to think about. So quality is a really crucial and I think sometimes a bit overlooked topic in operations management, and it kind of sits at the kind of end of the topic, but actually, in reality, and as we'll see throughout this session, it underpins a lot of what is for the operations manager the main focus of their improvement effort. So, what do we mean by quality? What is it, and why is it so important? How can quality problems be diagnosed? In other words, how can we make sense of where quality problems might be and what their nature is? What steps lead towards conformance specification? In fact, what do we mean by conformance specification? And then towards the end of the session, I'll talk about total quality management, TQM. Certainly, if you go into lots of organisations and talk to people in charge of the operations about TQM, they'll know exactly what you mean. Okay, or they'll have a good idea of what you mean and a sense of what you mean. So we'll tackle some of that in this session as well. Okay, so there's the transformation model, and here is the transformation section in the middle. So far in this module, we've looked at direction of the operations, the design of the operations, and over the last few sessions, we've looked at delivery of the operations. Now, where we are is in the development. Now, quality management really overlaps between delivery of the operation and developing the operation. It kind of bridges those two sections. So we're looking at quality management now, and then we'll look at operations improvement in the last session. So what do we mean by quality? Here's two examples of vehicles. Tata make the cheapest car in the world, and Rolls-Royce make arguably probably the most expensive car in the world. Is that a definition of quality? It's a view of quality. Okay, I think most people would say that the best quality car is a Rolls-Royce. But are they right to say that? Well, if they do, that's what we call a transcendent approach. It's something innate to the object or the product or the service for that matter. So, and often, in fact, and in reality, a lot of people see quality from this perspective, that there's something innate in an object or a service they consume, and that innate aspect of that product or service bestows upon it some sense of quality. Even I, in my daily life, think, refer to things in these terms, and that is a way of viewing quality, but it's a really useless to a operations manager. Okay, so what an operations manager needs is something they can make sense of, something that can be measured, something that can be understood from an operations perspective. So what we have is a number of other ways of thinking about quality. We have a user-based approach, a value-based approach. Now both these are about what the consumer, the user, the person demanding the product or service makes of the product or service. Then from the supply side, we have a product-based approach. What is the product? What are we trying to achieve in the product? And then a manufacturing-based approach. Can we specify the nature of the product and look at it from an engineering perspective? Now, from the point of view of operations management, what we want really is to think about bringing the bottom four of those together. So user-based approaches, value-based, product-based and manufacturing-based approaches to thinking about quality. And that provides us with this synthesis definition, which is generally used in operations management, which is that quality is consistent conformance. So doing the same thing over and over again to customer expectations. So what does the customer expect? Not what they want, not even what they need, but what do they expect? Okay, so can we conform to those expectations on a consistent basis? In other words, do it over and over and over again. Okay, so we have a number of things coming out of this. We've got conformance, we've got expectations, and we've got consistency. Now, consistency is about variability, really. Is there any variability in what we're producing, what we're delivering? Now, there's a distinction often made in operations between services and products when we talk about quality, and the reason for that is because services are delivered and then consumed at the point of delivery normally. Not always, you can store some services, but most services are produced and then consumed simultaneously. And although there is a tangible element to services, so the example of this picture is of a service being delivered, and you can see there's a tangibility to it. Most services are intangible, and in fact, a lot of, even where there's tangible elements to a service, there are a lot of intangible aspects as well. This separates services from products, where products are purely tangible things. They are things, objects, which can be consumed. Okay, so in services, the focus is on the link between perceived and expected service quality. So a customer will expect a service quality, as I mentioned before in my definition, but also has a perception of what they think that service quality actually is, which is more difficult to measure than a product. The rater measures are often used. Now, these were devised by Parasaraman and colleagues, and there's a reference there to these. These are reliability, assurance, so how assured are we of the service, tangibility, which is the tangible aspects of the service, the uniform of the waiter, the products on the breakfast table and so forth in that picture. Empathy, to what extent do we feel that the service provider understands us, can make sense of us, and is understanding of our needs and our wants. And finally, responsiveness. To what extent can they respond to our changing demand? There's a lot of critique about the ServQual validity, but nevertheless it's extensively used in services environments, and if you end up working in a service environment, you will quite possibly come across these measures, or measures like these. Okay, there's a little video from a TV series on BBC. You can see the YouTube link at the bottom there in greyed out. Feel free to watch that if you want to. So, what are the characteristics of quality? They kind of pick up on some of those rater measures, but are more general and can cover any kind of product or service really. So it's about functionality. How well does a product or service do the job for which it's intended? Okay, so is the product or service functional in that sense? Appearance. So most products, most services will have some sort of appearance aspect to it. Aesthetic appeal, look, feel, smell, sound, and so forth. Reliability. Are we getting consistent product or consistent service over time? It's crucial. Okay, so it's about that consistency again. Durability. What is the life of the product or service? Now, you may possibly have come across the term built-in obsolescence, and this is about products often, but also services, I guess, which have a lifespan which is delimited, and the reason it's delimited is to encourage continual consumption. So new products and new services are introduced, and the organisation wants you to continue to purchase products and services, so they don't want to give you something which will last for a long time. So this is built into our expectations of products and services. Recovery. So if something goes wrong, can it be rectified and resolved? And finally, contact. This is a service element really. So all services are, or nearly all services have some sort of a contact element, often person to person. Products often, and nearly always actually, involve some kind of contact element to them. You go and purchase a product from a supermarket or from a store, and you'll have some sort of person-to-person contact. And so, in many respects, and yeah, there's a kind of a term which is used, this kind of odd term really, I guess, which is used extensively in operations research and operations management research, which is called servitization, which is the servicing or service element of the product. And finally, perception. What do we as customers perceive of the product or service? So, we talked about defining quality and characteristics of quality in general terms. Really, from an operations perspective, what we're doing when we think about defining quality is thinking about the gap between perceptions and expectations. So, here we have three scenarios. One, the expectations for the product or service exceed the perceptions of the product or service. There's a gap. Two, the customer's expectations for the product or service are the same as their perceptions. There's no gap. And three, that their expectations for the product or service are less than their perceptions. In other words, their perceptions exceed their expectations. Again, there's a gap. Now, of these three scenarios, you might ask yourself which one is the best one to be in for an organisation. And lots of people go for the third one, where perceptions exceed expectations. So often you will come across an organisation and they say our aim or our mission is to delight and exceed the expectations of our customers. And this seems like a good thing, and in some ways it is a good thing. But if you want repeat customers, then the problem in scenario 3 is you're always increasing the expectations of the customer. So if they see their expectations have been exceeded, then next time their expectations are raised, that gap closes. Okay, and then you as a organisation have to either meet those new expectations or exceed them again. And in fact, your expectations being exceeded on a regular basis become the new norm, and that is a highly problematic situation to be in. For most organisations, where they want to be is in the middle, the second scenario. Okay, and there we are. Perceived quality is poor, perceived quality is good, perceived quality is acceptable. Most organisations want perceived quality to be acceptable. Great if perceptions exceed expectations, but this creates a real problem for the organisation. Okay, back to Parasaaraman and colleagues, and here we have the gap analysis, which underpins. It was really developed for services, but that actually underpins most organisations' operations ways of thinking about understanding quality. Okay, so the gap analysis is a number of gaps, 4 gaps plus a potential gap. We have at the top the customer's domain. The customer is consuming the product or service, they have demand for the product or service, and they have expectations and perceptions, as I've just shown you, and there may or may not be a gap. Okay, so how are their expectations formed? Well, through a number of things, such as previous experience of products and services they consumed, maybe from your organisation or from other organisations, word of mouth communications from other people, and their image of the product or service. So these things are formed through advertising, marketing, those sort of things, through reviews on websites and so forth. All these things feed into an expectation, and then they perceive the product or service they actually receive, and a customer, you do it, I do it, everyone does it, compares their expectations against their perceptions. So, customers' expectations form their own specification of quality. This isn't normally or nearly never expressed in any tangible way, but we all have a sense of what we think quality means in our own heads. Now, the organisation is delivering the product or service, so there's a boundary between the customer and the operation. And the operation is delivering a product or service which the consumer will perceive. That product or service is based on the organisation's specification of quality, which isn't necessarily the same as the customer's specification of quality. That organisation's specification of quality is based on the management or the part of the organisation devises the operation. It's their concept of the product or service. So there may be a gap between the organisation specification of quality and the customer specification of quality. In fact, there almost always is. And it's trying to close that gap and inform the customer specification that is an important part of the organisation's job, really. So if there is a gap there, that's what's known as the first gap. The second gap is between what the management understands by the product or service and how that is turned into a specification of quality. The third gap is between what the organisation aims to deliver in terms of specification and what it actually delivers in terms of a final product or service. And the fourth gap is between the product or service that's being delivered and how that product or service is portrayed to customers. That's through advertising, communications, feedback from other customers and so forth. Okay, so it's a very handy, very kind of helpful model to navigate through the potential quality problems an organisation might face. Okay, so let's think about that perception expectation gap in a bit more detail. So we're taking ourselves through the 4 gaps, potentially 5, but 4 gaps. Okay, gap 1 is about ensuring consistency between internal quality specification and expectations of the customer. The job for the organisation is in lots of areas, particularly marketing. The operations has a role in understanding informing, communicating what marketing needs to deliver, and also understanding what marketing is telling customers, and also understanding what the product or service development function within the organisation is seeking to develop for the organisation. Okay, these are all kind of strategic things, really, and I think right in the early part of the module, I talked about operations and its overlap with product and service development and marketing. And here you can see why those 3 functions of the organisation are so important and interact so closely. Okay. With gap 2, it's about ensuring internal specification meets the intended concept of design. And you can see again, all 3 parts of the organisation overlap here. Gap 3 is about ensuring the actual product or service conforms to internally specified quality. In other words, what we're delivering meets our specification, what we intended to deliver. And this is solely in the domain of the operations. It's the job of the operations to make sure that what they produce, be it a product or service, is what they said they produce. Okay, it's about control. And finally, we have ensuring promises to customers concerning the product or service can really be delivered, and this is about marketing. Now, the key thing here in this process is really about communication between departments and functions within the organisation, and communication to customers. Okay, and certainly in research I've done and research which has been carried out by others, what people find is that this is the one area where organisations are very weak, that marketing is promising all sorts of things without really speaking to the operations function or the product and service development function. Product and service development is developing new products and services without really much thought to how they can be actually delivered by the operations. Operations is struggling to produce a product or service that has been specified by the development section of the organisation, and so there's a lot of the gaps kind of inevitably appear. And finally, the last one, marketing is over promising. Okay, so that's what we think. That's how we can define quality. Well, who's responsible for quality? Where's responsibility lie? Okay, so in some sense, each department has its own responsibility for quality, and every department within the organisation has a job, a role in quality delivery. The problem is that this tends to be isolating. It's not particularly biased, but it's isolating. Each department doesn't speak to each other, and you end up with isolation within the organisation. Certainly lots of parts of the organisation will say it's the production or operation function. Okay. Within the technical function, possibly. And finally, really, and probably crucially, I would say, the supplier-customer relationship. How is this mediated? How is this managed? How is it understood? Okay, so how can we measure quality? Really, in the broadest sense, we can measure quality in two ways, by attributes or by variables. Attributes are a yes-no answer. Variables are a range, a scale. Take two examples. We have a light bulb. Now, a light bulb can either work or not work. That's an attribute. When you switch it on, is it working? Okay. And it has a variable, which might be the emission from the light bulb. Another example, these are straight out of Slack's book, a turbine blade. Okay, so an attribute might be the number of defects in the turbine blade, and the variable might be the length of the blade. So I'm sure the length of the blades of the turbine blades have a very small tolerance, but there will be some tolerance there. Okay, so organisations use attributes and variables in order to create a statistical relationship which they can measure on a regular basis in order to make sense of the quality for their organisation. This is the starting point for most organisations. Beyond just having some sort of craft approach, most organisations, when they first get into and try to make sense of quality within their organisation, and actually where most organisations still are, is with very basic statistics. Okay? So statistical process control is the fundamental way of trying to make sense of quality within an organisation. It relies on mean values for variables and variability about the mean. So how do we do this? We go through control charting. Let's think of a product or service, it doesn't matter what it is, and can it be measured? Can its performance be measured over time? This is the crucial thing we're doing. So it could be cars coming out of a production line, and you can break down the different aspects of car assembly into probably hundreds of different processes, and each of those can be measured. Similarly with services, you can measure all sorts of aspects of service delivery, and you can measure those over time. Why would we do this? That's the question. Well, here we go. We have a aspect of the operation which we're measuring over time. That's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have time. So there we are. We have measurements going up and down. Those could be very great or very small. Doesn't matter. And on the whole, it seems fine. It's going around a average somewhere. There's our model. There's our graph. Now, is it getting better or worse? Well, occasionally it seems to be getting better. Other times it's getting worse. Is variation important? Is it acceptable variation or unacceptable variation? And so in other words, how do we know that the performance is what we call natural, or that in other words, there's just random variation in the process, or whether it's a problem that we can assign to a particular cause? In other words, an assignable variation. So we use process charting, process control charting. The last point on this particular diagram appears to be particularly low, but how do we know whether it's too low? Well, what we do is to investigate. Well, we need to understand the randomness around of variation in the process to understand whether that last point, or maybe the last and third to last point, are particularly problematic. Okay, what we need are control limits, and here we are. So I've drawn those on the graph. You can see two of them appear to be outside that, but those are only roughly drawn. Well, how have I come to develop those control limits? Well, this is through collection of data. So over time we'll sample some, or maybe all, but normally some of the any particular aspect of the process. After a first sample, this might be our range. After a second sample, this could be our range. After a third sample, this could be our range. Second day, third day, and what you find is that there'll be a distribution around the mean, and we have to decide where we're going to draw our control limits, what's acceptable to us and what's not acceptable to us. Now, distribution around the mean, that's normal distribution, okay, starts to appear. So we can take that normal distribution curve, find the mean in the middle, and we have a variation around the mean, and that is understood through standard deviation. There's one standard deviation, and that is 68% of all observations. Two standard deviations will be 95.4% of all observations. Three standard deviations will be virtually all observations. So anything, we could argue, anything outside that will be highly problematic, because everything inside that is, or virtually everything inside that is normal variation for this particular process. So how do we do this? If we understand normal distribution, which describes random variation when a process is operating normally, then we can use the distribution to draw control limits. Now all I've done here is put that normal distribution curve on its side. Looks a bit like a bow and arrow, doesn't it? And the mean is in the middle on the purple line, and then we have standard deviations around the mean, and that's 3 standard deviations away from the mean, which is very commonplace in most organisations, and we have that normal variation and that control chart, and we can see that the last point is outside the 3rd standard deviation around the mean. That we might think could be an assignable or problematic thing. Everything else going on there is inside the standard deviation. Sorry, inside the 3 standard deviations and in the normal distribution curve. So that final point might be an assignable cause, i.e. the process is out of control. So we have an upper control limit and lower control limit. There's some points and they go outside. And this is the kind of thing you might have in an organisation. So you have the mean, x, on the y-axis, and then you have standard deviations around the mean, and the upper and lower warning limits might be put in place to draw management attention to a particular process. So if they collect data on a regular basis, the operation manager sees the data on a regular basis on a spreadsheet or some other report, and that process is reaching an upper or lower warning limit, then the organisation might scrutinise that particular process, watching to see whether it reaches the control limit or action limit. And if it does, then they'll take action. If it doesn't, it may just come back into normal what we regard as normal variation, and that's fine. Then that scrutiny will diminish and the process will be allowed to run. Okay? So warning limits are there really to stop things going out of control in the first place. They just draw scrutiny to a particular process. Okay, so assessment of income materials. Acceptance sampling is about organisations, suppliers providing, or even internal supply chain processes, providing products or services, particularly products, materials of one kind or another, which need to be either accepted or rejected. Can't accept everything, so we use acceptance sampling, which means taking a sample, a predetermined proportion of the products arriving and checking those. Technique involves determining the acceptable quality level. In other words, what are we prepared to accept as a failure rate in terms of the products and materials which are coming into our organisation. This could be 1%, 2%, etc. It involves the construction of P-charts, which is proportional charts. Okay, so let's think about quality as a process within an organisation. A lot of organisations, even today, even now, and especially new organisations, are really trying to just make sure that the basic things don't go wrong. They're trying to put into place systems to allow process error detection and then fix the problems when they happen. Many more mature organisations, small and medium-sized enterprises and even large organisations have reached a stage where they analyse processes, they have quality standards in place, and they use statistics to measure quality performance. More sophisticated organisations are starting to put into place quality systems, so they make the management of quality a systematic process within the organisation. They might use tools like quality costing, problem-solving techniques, and quality planning, and I'll talk about some of these when I'm in the remainder of the session. And then over time, quality becomes a strategic activity. Okay, it's about teamwork, it's about people working together, communication across and between and within departments. It's about empowerment of staff to fix problems and stop processes before they get out of control, and customers may be co-opted into the way that quality is delivered from the organisation. So some terms which you may or may not be familiar with. At the outset, most organisations, a lot of organisations, even today, as most organisations have only ever got to inspecting the process, making sure that mistakes don't get out to the customers. Okay. When they start to employ statistics and quality standards, then we get to what we call quality control, okay, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Over time, if you start to build quality systems and develop quality systems within your organisation, then we have what we call quality assurance. When you get to a much more strategic perspective of quality, then you are getting into quality management. So it's not a one or other thing, it's a kind of process that organisations go through from basic inspection through to total quality management. Some organisations never get to TQM. Okay, they'll get to quality control and be happy with that. Others will push and push and push towards TQM. Why do they do that? Well, what they're trying to do really is go beyond just saying, okay, we'll make sure that problems don't get out to our market, that our customers aren't unhappy, to trying to drive the cost of quality problems out of the organisation and turn quality into a way of competing against other organisations. Okay, so this brings us on to TQM, and in this section I'll talk about what we mean by TQM. There is actually a lot of overlap with other techniques, and I'll talk about some of those as well. In particular, you may remember I mentioned lean production, and some of the ideas, concepts of TQM chime very heavily with lean production and just-in-time production. So I'll talk about TQM and some of the techniques which are used and employed to help manage quality within organisations. Okay, so the objective of TQM is that all employees seek to improve quality. How do they do this? They measure things, ensure quality happens at source, that the process is unable to produce things which fail to meet quality standards. Okay, and this is done through participative programs. Now there is a distinction here between some of these things I'm talking about here and lean production. Lean production would say that you get the system, the process right, and if you get it right, then quality failure can't happen. Because remember, when I talked about lean production, quality failure is one of the many 7 wastes in production. Okay, TQM focuses on measurement as the basis. Okay, key themes are continuous improvement, like Kaizen in lean production, right first time, which is similar to zero defects, and customer satisfaction. When I talk about business process re-engineering, then you'll see where some other programs focus on customer more than what the organisation delivers. Okay, so there's a kind of philosophy underpinning TQM. So the approach is management-led. It's a kind of top-down thing, really. It's an initiative driven by management. The scope is company-wide. So the perspective is going beyond the operations and product development, okay, to encompass all parts of the organisation. Okay, the scale is everyone. So everyone from the cleaner, who empties the bins, all the way up to top management. Everyone within the organisation is supposedly responsible for trying to understand and make sense of quality and buy into the TQM philosophy. So the philosophy is about prevention. Things, not detection, not spotting things, but prevention of things ever going wrong in the first place. And so the process is about driving out sources of quality failure. The standard is right first time. Any failure is unacceptable. And the control is through quality costing normally. The theme is about continuous improvement, always looking to drive those costs down. Okay, there's something called the Joiner Triangle, named after Joiner, who developed it, and it's about the key aspects of TQM. So we have commitment, so it's about commitment of the organisation, everyone within the organisation, involvement, and crucially, this is all underpinned with a scientific approach. So commitment is about an obsession with quality, as it would say, throughout the organisation. That this becomes the cornerstone of the organisation, and from this, everything else derives. Okay, the involvement is about everyone working as a team, and scientific approach is about logical, analytical measurement and understanding processes. Cost of quality is an underpinning of TQM. So on the y-axis we have the cost of quality, and on the x-axis we have time. And there are, I guess the way to see it is 3 or maybe even 4 costs to quality. First one is prevention. Okay, the cost of stopping things going wrong in the first place, stopping mistakes happening. The second one is appraisal, checking, measurement. The third one is failure costs. So if something goes wrong, it has to be either fixed or scrapped or reworked or done. Something has to be done to it. Okay, and that's a massive cost for lots of organisations. So the idea of prevention and appraisal is to drive down failure costs. And the third one, or the last one, is appraisal before a second process of appraisal before products go out to customers. Together, these are the cost of quality. Everything else is free. So Joseph Duran had a famous phrase, which is that quality is free, poor quality is what costs an organisation money. Okay, and these costs can be enormous in organisations. So failure costs are huge for many organisations and have to be driven out. You're scrapping work, it's a waste of money, a waste of effort. You're fixing things which went wrong, that's a waste of money, waste of effort. So organisations loathe failures, internal failures. Okay, what do? They do all sorts of things to try and prevent those failures. Appraisal, checking in other words, and prevention, activities to stop things going wrong. Prevention activities might be things like training, would be things like processes, parts of the process which are there to stop things going wrong. Okay. And then finally, what I haven't added onto this is the cost should failed products and failed services reach the customer, which is an enormous potential cost and something which all organisations are terrified of. Okay. Now the idea of cost quality is that initially, as you can see, the prevention costs and appraisal costs go up, increase, in order to drive down failure costs. Okay, but then the theory goes that as you progress along this process, you can start to bring down appraisal costs, bring down prevention costs, whilst failure costs continue to reduce. The ultimate aim is to drive out all internal failures by making processes failure-free, so the failures just can't occur, and reduce and at the same time reduce your checking costs and your prevention costs. Okay, some critical issues around TQM. Now, TQM is very widely used in organisations all over the world, and has become a very, very common way of thinking about delivering not just quality, although quality is in the term, but actually all the objectives that an organisation might want to achieve. Okay, so although it's very widely used, there have been some issues. There are frequently issues with this, as well as many other processes of improvement in organisations. So the first one is TQM. Definitions of TQM, understanding of TQM varies wildly between different organisations and is contextual. So a lot of researchers, academics will say that actually what we're looking at is something which is contingent on the environment within which the organisation works, contingent in terms of the marketplaces that the environment that the organisation is trying to sell to. Okay. The second one is that some companies have claimed a great deal of success in changing the culture of their organisations, because really TQM is about culture change. It's about organisations working in a different way and embedding that culture into the organisation. Now, certainly research has suggested that those claims can be questioned. Coordinated TQM practices and programs can often appear very patronising. They say, well, this is the way it's done, this is the way it can be done, this is the best way, there's no other way, and you guys don't know anything, and you'll now do this. And it's kind of and that's really driven by the top-down perspective, which TQM often has. Finally, TQM is an umbrella term. So its implementation involves a whole different variety of activities and initiatives which are often based in theory and theoretically sound, but then have to be interpreted and made sense of and turned into practical activities which the organisation or people within the organisation can implement. Okay, so again, from research we can look at what happens with TQM programs, and what people have found is that there's an initial great deal of enthusiasm. Oh yes, we're going to change our organisation, things are going to be marvellous from now on. We're going to drive out all the failures, we're going to cut down on all this checking we have to do, and we'll focus on the key thing about organisations, which is delivery of value. Okay, so cutting out all the waste. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning, but then that starts to taper off. So in the early stages we have learning and understanding, increasing enthusiasm, growth. And what we see is effectiveness increasing, and then a levelling off stage. And this is really where we got what my first professor, who was in charge of my research program when I was doing research into this, said was a low-hanging fruit. So at the early stages you pick up the low-hanging fruit, the obvious problems, but then you get into the more difficult, tricky problems, and that's where things start to become difficult. Then disillusionment sets in. We're not really achieving anything. TQM initiatives then tend to get rebooted and repackaged in efforts to revitalise the programme. That can work, it sometimes doesn't work. So, coming back to those key questions. What do we mean by quality, and why is it so important? How can quality problems be diagnosed? What steps lead towards conformance to specification? And what is TQM? So hopefully you can answer all these questions now, and or at least read around this subject and try to think about how you might answer those questions if you don't have a clear idea of whether you can answer those now. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and the final session will be about operations improvement.